We'll begin, as is our custom, with the summary in a nutshell from Chabad.org. So it was in the email, otherwise you could just listen. Here we go. Moses instructs the people of Israel to appoint judges and law enforcement officers in every city. Justice, justice shall you pursue, he commands them, and you must administer it without corruption or favoritism. Crimes must be meticulously investigated and evidence thoroughly examined. A minimum of 2 credible witnesses is required for conviction and punishment. So for the last few months, we've been studying the laws of witnesses in Maimonides. One of the sources in the written Torah for the laws of witnesses is in this week's portion, so that's nice to see. Second paragraph. In every generation, says Moses, there will be those entrusted with the task of interpreting and applying the laws of the Torah. According to the law that they will teach you and the judgment that they will instruct you, you shall do. You shall not turn away from the thing that they say to you, to the right or to the left. This is the institution of the Sanhedrin, the high court, the Jewish high court. Sanhedrin itself is a Greek word, so it doesn't appear in the Torah, but the Torah is referring to the highest body of the highest judicial body within Judaism, the Sanhedrin, which sat in Jerusalem. And it's interesting that something that's so important, such an integral part of Judaism today, is the concept of machloket, of disagreement, of various opinions. Initially, the way the Torah expresses it, there was not supposed to be any disagreement among Israel. In other words, there could be disagreements, but not about what to do. There's supposed to be one halacha, one ruling, because there's one, just like there is in the secular legal system, there's one final body that has the final say. Of course, today we don't have the Sanhedrin, and therefore, not only today, this is for the past 2,000 years, and therefore Judaism has tremendous amount of disagreement and even variations within the halacha, but that's another discussion. Shoftim also includes the prohibitions against idolatry and sorcery, laws governing the appointment and behavior of a king, the guidelines for the creation of cities of refuge for the inadvertent murderer are also set forth are many of the rules of war. The exemption from battle for one who has just built a home, planted a vineyard, married, or is afraid and soft-hearted. The requirement to offer terms of peace before attacking the city, and the prohibition against wanton destruction of something of value, exemplified by the law that forbids to cut down a fruit tree when laying siege. In this context, the Torah makes the famous statements, "For man is a tree of the fields." The Parsha concludes with the law of the Egla Arufa, the special procedure to be followed when a person is killed by an unknown murderer and his body is found in a field, which underscores the responsibility of the community and its leaders, not only for what they do, but also for what they might have prevented from being done. So again, the final paragraph of the portion is the Egla Arufa. That's the story of a person who's found, the corpse that's found dead. We don't know who killed the person. So there's a whole ceremony where the people, with a court, has to come down and kill a heifer and declare that we don't know what happened here, we have not seen anything here, and then God will forgive the people for this murderer, and we'll discuss the significance, this tremendous significance in that concluding story of the Parsha. Okay, so there's a lot to say. So if anybody wants to ask a question on something specific on the Parsha or on the nutshell of the Parsha, that's good. Otherwise, I'll just start talking a little bit. And please don't hesitate to interject and ask and share and explore together, because that's what we're supposed to be doing, even though we're on Zoom. Okay, as is our custom, we'll start with the beginning. We'll read a few verses in the beginning, and then we'll jump around. So the Parsha starts in Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 18. And I'm just going to read the first few verses. Judges and police officers you shall appoint for yourself in all your cities that Hashem your God is giving you for your tribes, who will judge the people righteous justice. Do not pervert justice. Do not display favoritism. Do not accept bribery, for bribery blinds the eyes of the wise and distorts words that are just. Pursue absolute justice. That's the translation in Hebrew. It's justice, justice shall you pursue. Relatively famous verse. So that you may live and inherit the land that Hashem your God is giving you. Okay. So this is the introduction that you have to appoint judges everywhere, and you have to treat everybody equally and pursue justice. Okay. What does this mean? In addition to the simple meaning, all the commentators, and especially the Hasidic commentators, talk about the fact that this verse is written in the singular. Everything about these verses is the singular. Judges and police officers, you shall appoint for yourself. Titein lecha, you shall appoint. In Hebrew, in English, you is neutral. It's not singular or plural. But in Hebrew, there is a you that's singular and a you that's plural. And over here, it's clear that the Torah uses the you that's singular. And so in all these verses. So why does the Torah use singular language if we're talking to the collective Jewish people? So the simple answer, in other words, the grammatical answer is that because we're talking to an entire people, we're not talking to an individual, we're talking to the community, so you can refer to the community as a single unit. Because we're not talking about the hundreds of thousands of individuals within the unit, we're talking about the unit as a whole, the community. So the community has to appoint judges. That's the conventional interpretation. That's why the singular use in regard to appoint justice and judges fits, because we're not talking to many individuals. We're talking to the members of the community as a whole. Okay, that's a simple interpretation. Then along comes the Hasidic interpretation. And the Hasidic interpretation says, yes, it's everything in the Torah is, even the parts of the Torah that talk to the nation as a whole are also talking to every individual. And therefore, you can read these verses, and the verses can be that you as an individual have to appoint judges. Why do I have to appoint judges? I'm not in the business. I'm not a senator. I don't confirm the judges. I'm not a president. I don't nominate the judges. Well, I'm just thinking about this. I don't want to get political, but I guess that it's elections coming up. So of course that in America, the process of appointing judges has become somewhat politicized, and a lot of people go to vote because they want to affect who the judge will be. So I don't know that that's such a terrible thing, because the verse says, "Judges and officers you shall appoint." Says Rashi, the simple meaning is that it's referring to, I think Rashi says this. I don't see Rashi says it, but the commentaries explain that this is referring to the people who appoint the judges. If you're going to appoint judges, you should appoint somebody who's a proper judge. So in a democracy, at least in the system that we have, every individual, in a sense, by extension, is the one who appoints judges, because you elect people who then appoint judges. So maybe going to the election and voting, and again, I'm not telling you who to vote for, maybe going to the election and voting is actually, I'm thinking now, maybe it's actually a fulfilling the biblical commandment of appointing judges, because it's your responsibility. In a democracy, it's your responsibility. And I just want to say that the concept to appoint judges, here it says, appoint judges in all your cities, meaning referring to the Jewish people in the land of Israel. But it's not really in the land of Israel. The commentaries say this applies to wherever Jewish people live. But in addition to that, the concept of appointing judges is not just a mitzvah for the Jewish people. It's one of the 7 Noahide laws. We spoke about it this past Sunday. It's one of the 7 Noahide universal laws that apply to all people. And every society, they have an obligation, a moral obligation to appoint judges. So not only when the Jew goes to vote, is he fulfilling this commandment of appointing judges, but the Gentile who's going to vote is also commanded to appoint judges. So when you go to vote, whatever the day of November it is, you're probably fulfilling a biblical commandment. So understand that it's an important concept. Okay, That's for that. That's for the entertainment. Now we get to the Hasidic interpretation. So we're discussing why is it's written in the singular. Judges and officers shall you place for yourself. You shall appoint. You shall appoint for yourself. But it's all in the singular. B'chol sharecha, and all your gates. This, you could have written this in the plural. In Hebrew, you're supposed to write this in the plural. So again, the simple interpretation is that because we're not talking to a collection of individuals, we're talking to that collective, to the nation. Therefore, you could speak in the singular as well. That's a valid interpretation. The Hasidic interpretation is always applying this to the person himself or herself. And therefore, the Kabbalists and the Hasidic masters say as follows. The verse could be read referring to myself. I have gates. You see, the verse says, judges and officers shall you appoint for yourself in all your cities. Here they translate cities, but the Hebrew word is she'arecha, your gates. A gate is the opening to the city. Right? You have it in the Shema. In the Shema, the last word of the first paragraph of the Shema is Uchsaftam. You write them. You write the Shema al mezuzot beitecha, on the mezuzah, on the doorposts of your home, ubi she'arecha, and on your gates. That's referring to the gate of your courtyard, from your courtyard to the street. But she'arecha, also the courtyard of your city, also the gate of your city. Now in this case, when you talk about, or when this verse says, place judges in all your gates, it means at the entrance of every city. Okay. Say the Hasidic commentaries that every individual is a city. And every individual has gates. And what does a gate mean? A gate is the space where you enter and you leave the city. So my gate is the place and the space where I interact with the broader world. So my eyes, how I see, how I take in information from the outside world, my speech, how I talk, how I express myself, how right inside myself I have my ideas and my emotions, but that's within me, that's within the city. The gate of the city is the place that interface where I interact with the outside world, just like the gate, which is sort of the border between that which is within and that which is without. So the Hasidic commentaries say that when the verse says, place judges and officers in all your gates, in addition to the simple meaning, which is you have to set up a court of justice, a justice system, it's also within yourself, a person that before you interact with the world, before you take in, or before you express, you have to use your judgment. It's be aware that what you say is now you're leaving your own space, you're leaving your own mind, you're interacting with people outside of you. You may say something to somebody, you may not even realize the positive or negative effect that these words will have upon the other person. So in other words, it's awareness. It's awareness that you are not living within yourself, even though, in other words, you have your own personality, but be aware, especially when you're at the gates, when you're at the point where you interact with others. And be the judge. Be a judge means make a judgment call. Think about it. Be aware of what you're doing. Don't just act spontaneously regarding the gates. And in addition to the judge, you also have to have the officer. What is the officer? The officer is the one who implements the judgments. So it's very good to have good ideas of how I'm going to behave. But then the officer is the commitment and the willpower and the consistency to pull through and act according to the ideals and the ideas that I have within myself. So that's the introduction to this parsha. You cannot open a Hasidic book from all the various Hasidic courts on this parsha without reading about the fact that you have to have judges at your own gates. Before you say a word, you have to think about what is the other person going to hear? What is the other person going to take away from this? And when you're aware of that, that will help us interact with the word. I'm embarrassed to say, but I'm not embarrassed to say, but I'm pulling up here on Facebook. I saw a nice post yesterday from somebody. I'm going to give her credit in a second. I just have to find it, see if it's her. And this reminded me of what it says in the portion in this week's portion. So let me see if I can find it. It was a very good quote, worth the 5 seconds to find it. Okay, this was shared by Dale Atkins, who spoke at Chabad of Greenwich a few times and on the Zoom, and she's a famous psychologist, and she has a lot of insights on how to create an environment of kindness and serenity. beautiful. She wrote books. So the quote she posted yesterday is as follows. I see it yesterday and I said, wow, this is exactly what the Torah is saying. This is what the Hasidic masters are saying when they say you have to put gates, you have to put judges and awareness at all your gates when you interact with others. So here it goes. Today you could be standing next to someone who is trying their best not to fall apart. So whatever you do today, do it with kindness in your heart. In other words, just the awareness. You're speaking to somebody. You don't know what the other person is going through. You're just trying to express yourself. But understand, be aware that what you say may affect the other person, both to the positive and to the negative. So that judgment is that awareness of asking myself, how is what I'm going to say going to affect the other person? And therefore, am I saying it the right way, or do I have to adjust it? I'm not saying adjust what you want to say, but sometimes you have to adjust how you're going to say it. So that is the Hasidic introduction to this parsha. Now we can get down to some of the broader themes and broader points. So what is this parsha doing here? What's Moshe doing in this parsha that we don't have in the previous parshas? Or we don't have throughout, I think, the 5 books, really. So this parsha, one way to think about this is the parsha that discusses the institutions of Jewish life, or the national institutions of Israel. In other words, much of the Torah is about an individual. How do I become a better person? How do I come close to God? How do I celebrate the holidays? How do I bring an offering to God? How do I give charity? A lot of the mitzvot can apply to the individual. This parsha is really the institutions of Judaism. So we start with the justice system, right? The justice system is collective. The community has a responsibility to appoint judges. After the justice system, we talk about the Sanhedrin, so the Supreme Court. So that's also an institution, the institution of the Supreme Court. Then we talk about the institution, I don't want to call it institution, we talk about the concept of the prophet. There's a lot about the prophet here, how to know who is a true prophet and when to listen to a prophet who is telling us things that may not be consistent with the Torah. So the concept of not to listen to the sorcerers, to the people who say the future, but to listen specifically to the prophet, and when and how to listen to the prophet. So that's the institution of prophecy. That's not an individual person. That's the leadership position of the prophet. After the leadership of the prophet, we have more institutions. We have the institution of the monarchy. In other words, the laws of the king appear in this week's parsha, and how the king has to, how we appoint a king, and how the king, in some sense, we have to restrict the king's power, and how the king has to write an extra Torah scroll. So the point of the matter is, so here, this is another institution, the monarchy, the executive branch of government. So again, this is something that's not for the individual. This is the collective within the Jewish people. Then we talk about the city of refuge. City of refuge is also part of an institution. In other words, the community has to set up a city of refuge to protect the person who kills someone by mistake. It's to protect him from the avenging relative, but it's also an atonement. If, God forbid, somebody kills someone by mistake in biblical Israel, the penalty was you have to run away and live. You have to run and live in the city of refuge. So again, time and again, what we're introducing here, which we did not have in the previous portions. The previous portions is God speaking to every individual and telling the individual how the individual should behave. This parsha is introducing a new concept. We're going into Israel, which is why it's in Deuteronomy. We're about to enter Israel. So Moshe says, here are the institutions that you have to set up to better society as a whole. Justice system is first. Then comes the court. In other words, within the justice system and the Sanhedrin. Then comes the prophet, and then the king. Unless I'm changing the order here. No, justice system. Justice system. Justice system, king, profit. Oh, and of course, I forgot. At the end of the parsha is also the laws of war. Okay, so war also is something that does not apply to the individual. The war applies to the collective. How the collective goes to war, and how and the morality of war, and how to wage a moral battle. Again, this is not something that applies to the individual, but it applies to the collective. So that's what this parsha introduces. Fine. Why is this so interesting? Because typically, when people are trying to build society or build institutions for society or build or think about war, how society is going to advance its own causes. So typically, when you think about the community, the focus, you don't focus on the individual rights of the individual person. In other words, you have to build a country. If you have to build a country, the fact of the matter is that there are going to be certain individuals who are going to suffer. If you look at history, every time there was a national a building project, who knows how many people died? And I don't know. They say at least, I don't know, tens of thousands of people died building the Panama Canal. Tens of thousands of people died, probably hundreds of thousands building the Great Wall of China. I don't know how many people died building the Brooklyn Bridge because they stopped counting after a while. So, but that's the way it is. If you're going to build a country, if you're going to go to war, there are going to be certain people who are going to suffer. The individual is going to suffer for the collective. And when you're talking about, when you're referring to as the laws of setting up institutions, the emphasis on the individual is lessened. That's the conventional perspective. But what's interesting about this parsha is that woven within this parsha is an emphasis on the individual. And this is seen most powerfully at the end of the parsha, the last law, the law of the Egla Arufa, the law of the heifer that the heifer that you kill when you find an individual person that does not, and nobody knows who killed this person. Okay, so what does the law say? The law says if you find, you know what, let's read it inside. I'll go straight to the end. I'll read it inside. And again, this law comes after all the laws of war. And war, a lot of people die. But now, sometimes when you go to war and you come back from war, so the war makes you insensitive to the loss of life. So here's the final law of this week's parsha, chapter 21. If a corpse, in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 1, if a corpse is found in the land that Hashem your God is giving to you to inherit, fallen in the field, it is not known who smote him. Your elders shall go out and your judges and measure in the direction of the cities around the corpse. Now, the city nearest the corpse, the elders of that city are to take a calf heifer that has not been worked, that has not drawn a yoke. The elders of that city will take down the calf to a stony valley that is not to be tilled and not to be seeded, and they shall decapitate the calf in the valley. The Kohanim, descendants of Levi, will approach, because them did Hashem your God choose to serve him and to bless in Hashem's name, and they will decide every dispute and every nega. Nega is infliction. And all the elders of that city, those near the corpse, will wash their hands over the calf beheaded in the valley. They will loudly declare, our hands have not spilled this blood and our eyes have not seen. The Kohanim will say, forgive your people, Yisrael, whom you, Hashem, have redeemed, and do not allow innocent blood to be within your people Israel. The blood shall thus be atoned for in their behalf. Still, you must eradicate the liability for innocent blood from within you when you do what is upright in Hashem's eyes. So this law seems very primitive. Someone is dead, so what's the solution? We find a red heifer, we find an innocent red heifer, and we kill the red heifer. Everybody washes their hands and say, God, forgive us. And wonderful, you spill some blood, and now the blood is atoned for. Sounds very primitive, but in reality, this law is an unbelievable law that talks to you about how society has to protect every individual's rights, even the people who are the lowest in society. Okay, so you have to put yourself in the shoes of that culture to understand what's really happening. So who is traveling, what kind of person is going to appear dead in the field, and nobody knows who he is, and nobody knows who killed him. Okay? So think about how the prominent people travel. The prominent people travel in groups. Well, they have servants, but even if they don't have servants, people travel in groups, in caravans, because for protection. In the ancient world, that was very common. If I leave from a city and I reach to another city, typically my family knows knows where I left from. They're expecting me. They're expecting a letter from me. People know who I am. What's happening here in this verse is somebody is killed alone. Nobody knew who he is. He's found. So what does it tell you about the status, the social status of this person? The social status of this person is he's lonely, he's anonymous. Nobody knows who he is. Okay? How many lonely, anonymous people were killed this month in Connecticut or this year in Connecticut? I have no idea. Okay? So what's the law in the Torah? The law is, oh, you don't know who killed this person? If it's a regular murder, people know who he is. We know who the victim is. Then the court system will prosecute, try to find the murderer and prosecute the murderer. Here we have no idea who the murdered person was. We have no idea who the murderer is. So what do? So you have to now bring the elders of the court have to come down to the place, to the scene, to the crime scene, and create the ceremony. Why do the elders of the court have to come to the crime scene to create the ceremony? So there are a few reasons. First of all, there is a moral reason to show that the people, the leaders, are responsible for everything that takes place in society, even though the person that they're protecting here, the victim here, is somebody who is anonymous and not distinguished. But everybody has to stop what they're doing to try to investigate the crime. And another point is that if the court comes to this crime scene, the first thing that does is that creates awareness. You see, the problem is that nobody knows who this person is. So nobody knows where he's coming from. Nobody knows where he was going. No one knows who attacked him. It could be that there was a witness to the crime, or witnesses that saw certain things, but the witnesses don't realize what happened at the end, so they didn't come forward. So the first thing you need to do to prosecute this, to protect to investigate this crime, is you have to create awareness. And the way you create awareness is you have to bring the distinguished people of the court, the judges, to come to the scene and create the ceremony and create that awareness. And hopefully that will help the crime be investigated. So if you think about this parsha, the parsha starts, place judges at your gates. How does the parsha conclude? The judges are responsible not just for what happens within your gates, within the city, but the judges are also responsible for the people outside the city, for the people who are traveling alone, for the people that nobody has and no one knows who they are. In other words, they're anonymous and they're not significant. Even those individual people that the court, the institutions have to protect. And there's one more place where you see this contrast in this parsha, that even though we're talking about collective, we put great emphasis on the individual, and that's the city of refuge. So the city of refuge is an interesting law. It appears 3 times in the Torah. This is the 3rd time it appears. It appears once in the end of the 4th book and twice in the 5th book. And here again, it appears that the Moshe says that you have to set aside cities. If somebody kills someone by mistake, there's a work accident. So a work accident, the person who killed by mistake has to run away to the city of refuge, and he has to live there until the high priest passes away. It could be a month, it could be a year, it could be 10 years, it could be 50 years. Now, what's interesting about this work accident is that if you're going to build a country, if you're preparing to enter the land of Israel and building a country, I have a secret to tell you. There are going to be work accidents, right? So how does society prepare for these work accidents? So in the ancient world, there's a work accident. So the law is the person who killed someone by mistake would pay compensation, right? Because how do they value people? I think that's still the law. If it was by mistake, maybe you can get sued, but you have to pay some money. But it's not a crime if it was by mistake. If it was negligence, I mean, it wasn't gross negligence. So what was the common practice? The common practice is if you killed someone by mistake, you have to pay a fine. How much do you pay? Well, depending on what that person could earn. And that's how you compensate the family. That was the custom in the ancient world, in the Near East. And it's probably still in some ways affects the culture today. what does the Torah say? The Torah says no. The Torah says you killed someone by mistake. The fact that you're working to build a country does not allow you to lessen the protection for the individual's rights. And therefore, if I by mistake kill someone, even if it's by mistake and even if it's in the process of building for the collective, the moral sin still needs atonement, and therefore there's a significant fine in the sense, significant punishment in the sense you cannot just pay. You have to leave your home and you have to go to the city of refuge. And again, we don't always think about it this way, but the city of refuge highlights the power, the protection that we're giving to the individual person, and we don't just look the other way and say, well, accidents happen because we're sitting and building a country. So in the midst of highlighting the collective, we also emphasize the importance and the significance of the individual, because what is the purpose? What is the purpose of the king? What is the purpose of the institution? What is the purpose of the justice system? What is the purpose of the court system? The purpose of the collective is to protect the individual, because what is a collective? A collective is a collection of individuals. Okay, that's sort of on the big picture. Now we can get a little bit more specific, unless somebody wants to ask a question or make a joke or challenge or anything else. Okay, so there's a lot to say on this parsha, especially about the law. A lot of the law, the legal concept, the legal concepts in the Torah come from this week's parsha. But since it's Friday morning and it's 10:35, I'm not going to bore you with the technical aspects of the law. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the interesting concepts. I want to touch upon the concept of a prophet, because we spent a few months ago. We spent a few weeks on the book of Jonah. And this overlaps a little bit. So what the Torah doesn't want you to go to the sorcerers. Basically, in the ancient world, there's a whole industry of you go to the people who could tell you the future, you pay them a few dollars, and they tell you where to invest, how to invest, where to put your money, which stocks to buy, which stocks to sell, which nations will go to war. And basically, people would sort of follow these sorcerers almost blindly and put their trust in the sorcerers and in the astrologers. And the astrologers could look up at the skies or look up at your birth date and tell you what kind of person you will be, and therefore help you direct your efforts to something that you will be successful at, instead of wasting your efforts on something you may fail at. And in the ancient world, this becomes a whole industry, and the astrologers and the sorcerers are considered very, very prominent people, and they have a lot of power, and they influence the masses. And Maimonides writes that one of the ways that idol worship spreads is that through these sorcerers and astrologers, because the people sort of outsource their judgment to superstition. And once you outsource your judgment to superstition, then the sorcerers would introduce idol worship, because idol worship is superstitious. And that's how they would shift people away from the knowledge of the one God to the sorcerers, to idol worshippers. That's what Maimonides feels, and that's why he feels that the Torah is against the sorcery. So we're going to read a few verses, and then we're going to ask a question, because the Torah says, God forbid, don't speak to the astrologers. By the way, if you need to know what to do, speak to the prophets. So I asked you a question: what's the difference between the astrologer and the prophet? Seemingly, they're both the same thing. They're both telling you what's going to happen in the future. So what does it matter where you get your news? What does it matter which channel you get your news from? What's the matter if you go to the astrologer, or in the next booth you go to the prophet? What's the difference? The Torah just wants, in other words, is the Torah saying the prophet and the astrologer do the same thing, and it's just that the astrologer is making stuff up, and the prophet gets it, and the prophet gets his knowledge from God? Is that what it is? So let's read the verses. We'll see what happens. So I'm reading Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 9. Because you are entering the land that Hashem your God is giving you, do now learn to perpetrate the abominations of those nations. What are the great abominations? Let there not exist among you anyone who passes his son or daughter through fire, who practices the Kosim occult, who practices time frame occult, or who divines portentous events, or a sorcerer, or a snake charmer, one who evokes the spirit of Og or Yudoni, or communicates with the dead. Okay, so these are this is not a great the book I'm reading from is not a great translation. It's just repeating the Hebrew words. But you see, there's all forms of sorcery here. Speaking to the dead. You have in the book of Samuel the story of Saul, who went to speak to the witch, and the witch was able to recall Samuel. After Samuel died, Saul needed a consultation. So this is very common. It's very profitable business to be someone who can communicate with the dead. We're not allowed to do any of this. Why not? For Hashem's abomination is anyone perpetuating this. And because of these abominations, Hashem, your God, is expelling them from before you. In other words, why are they being expelled from the land? Not because they're murderers, not because they're idol worshippers, even though they were, but because they are following the astrologers, because they're following the sorcerers. What's so terrible about that? I don't know. Walk in perfect trust with Hashem, your God. Literally, tamim. Tamim means be complete. Here it's perfect trust. Don't sit and try to figure out what's happening in the future. You walk in trust with God. Rashi explains that walking in trust with God, you don't have to worry about the future, because whatever is going to happen, you can accept because you know that it's for the good. So there's no reason to be obsessed with the future. Of course, you have to prepare for the future, but you don't be obsessed with the future. That's what Rashi says. That's walk with perfect trust. Okay, beautiful. Now, let's read verse 14, continuing. Chapter 18, verse 14. Because these nations whom you are inheriting heed augurers and sorcerers, but as to you, Hashem, your God, has not given you their status. In other words, you don't need those sorcerers. You don't need that. Why not? Says 15, a prophet from your midst of your brethren, like me, will Hashem, your God, establish for you. Heed him. Meaning to say, Moshe speaking, says, don't worry, you don't need a sorcerer, because God will appoint for you a prophet just like I am, like Moshe. And then Moshe gives the history. Why do we have a prophet here? Because after the giving of the Torah, the people told God, we don't want to hear God's words anymore. It was too overwhelming. So God said, don't worry, I'll make a prophet. So Moshe says, we'll have prophecy. Okay, so now we're saying, you don't have to go to the sorcerers. Why not? Because you're going to have a prophet. What's the difference in a prophet and a sorcerer? Why is a sorcerer bad and a prophet good? And just to make the question a little stronger, with prophecy, we know the prophet doesn't always get everything right. If a sorcerer gets too many things that are wrong, he'll be out of a job. But a prophet could get things wrong all the time. Why does he get something wrong? So the commentaries explain that a prophecy for good will never change. If a prophet appears and he says something good will happen at a given specific time and date, and if that doesn't happen, then we know the prophet is a false prophet. Because if God promised something good, it will certainly happen. If God says something bad is going to happen, and then that does not occur, then that is not a proof that he's a false prophet, because God could be kind and avert the bad decree. There's a story in the Bible where there was a debate between two prophets, a false prophet and a true prophet. And the true prophet said, I forget that Hanani ben Azur was the false prophet, and the real prophet I think was Jeremiah. I may be mistaken. I should know this. But so there's this debate, and the real prophet is saying Jerusalem is going to be destroyed, and the false prophet is saying, no, you're going to be successful. I'm sorry, Tzidkiah ben Knana was the first false prophet. So here's what the true prophet tells the false prophet. The true prophet tells the false prophet, if I am disproven, in other words, I say Jerusalem will be destroyed. If it's not destroyed, that's not proof that I'm false, because God averted the bad decree. But if you're the false prophet, you say Jerusalem will not be destroyed. If that doesn't happen, then you are a false prophet, because again, God does not change. If it's a good promise, it's not going to change. So why am I telling this to you? I'm telling this to you because the prophet doesn't really tell you what's going to happen in the future. He only tells you something. So for example, when Jonah, just to go back to Jonah, when Jonah says that in 40 days, Nineveh is going to be destroyed. So if you listen to the prophet and you bet against the Nineveh stock market, you're going to lose all your money because you're following the prophet's words, and the prophet turned out to be wrong. So the prophet is actually not that reliable. He's only reliable if he says something good. He's not reliable if he says something bad. So one interpretation is that the sorcerers never speak specific. They always speak in generalities because they're not gonna speak specific because then they can be disproved. So for example, if somebody gets up and says, look, the stock market is going to go down, he's right. But if he knows exactly when, then he'll be a billionaire, right? So the sorcerer says something's going to happen. When is it going to happen? We don't know. They don't say exactly. A prophet, by definition, has to give a specific time because he has to be able to be disproved. I don't want to get into this right now, but the prophet, the way you get the way you test prophecy is that he has to give something specific to be able to be tested whether or not his prophecies are coming about. It's almost like we discussed about the witnesses, that a testimony that cannot be disproved is not a testimony. Right? We discussed this. It actually comes from this week's parsha. Now, if I offer testimony and I say, about 6 years ago a crime happened, that's not testimony. You must give the time and space and time and place and date. Why? Because if I don't have the date, then it can't be disproved. Because if I say a vague statement, 5 years ago a crime occurred, there's no way to disprove it. Because if I can prove that it didn't happen on this day, maybe it happened on the next day, it's too vague. So the Talmudic principle is any testimony that cannot be disproved is not a testimony. Same thing, a prophet. If a prophet doesn't give a time and place, doesn't give an exact date, if a prophet doesn't give a specifics that could be tested, then he's not a prophet. So that's not prophecy. So that's one reason why you would go to the prophet, because the prophet is giving you specifics, whereas the sorcerer just speaks in generalities. But that's not the most significant point. Here comes the most significant point, and this is why it's relevant to us, and this is why it's relevant to Yom Kippur, because of course on Yom Kippur we read the story of Jonah, which is probably the most famous story of a prophet in the Bible. Okay, except for Moshe, of course. Okay, so what's happening here? The reason why sorcerers are bad, astrologers are bad, and prophets are good is not because one knows the future and one doesn't. It's because one is in the business of predicting the future and one is not. The sorcerer is in the business of predicting the future. The prophet is not in the business of predicting the future. In fact, what's the success of the prophet? Success of the prophet is if his prophecy does not come true. Look at Jonah, right? Jonah, God tells him, go say that Nineveh will be destroyed. He doesn't want to go. Why doesn't he want to go? One of the reasons are because he knows God will forgive the people and his prophecy will not become true. So he knows, why am I going to go if it's not going to happen? In other words, Jonah knows his prophecy won't become true. I'll ask you another question. Was Jonah successful? Jonah himself was very upset at the end of the story. If you remember, we read the story, you remember from Shul on Yom Kippur, Jonah himself was very upset at the story. He didn't want to go. He wasn't happy that God forgave the people. He wasn't happy at all. So Jonah saw himself as a failure. The truth of the matter is, the reason why Jonah saw himself as a failure, because Jonah saw the institution of prophecy as an institution of predicting the future. If that's the case, he was indeed a failure. But God did not see it as a failure. God saw Jonah as a success. Why? You're a prophet, you made a prophecy, the prophecy did not come into fruition, the people changed, that's a success. And therefore God dispatched Jonah, not because Jonah is going to predict the future, because Jonah was successful in a different category. What was Jonah successful? Jonah was successful in doing the mission statement of a prophet, which is what? Okay, so here's the big difference. The astrologer tells you what your nature is. And therefore, he tries to direct you, whether or not he's making this stuff up, how he knows, how he doesn't know, it depends. It's a disagreement between Maimonides and Nachmanides, whether or not there was any truth to what the astrologer said. But let's not get into that question. What is if you're an astrologer, what's your job? Your job is to tell people their nature. And therefore, don't try to be something that you're not, because you're not going to succeed. Is this good for you? Well, we look at your nature, we look at your track record, we look at what you were successful in the past, and then we can extrapolate about the future. So, in a sense, What the astrologer is doing, the astrologer is the predicting, not so much the future, but predicting what your nature is. Here's where the prophet is so different. The prophet is not telling you what your nature is. To the contrary, the prophet is telling you that you're not trapped by your nature, that you could change and you could become something that you were not. And that is the moral, the big moral idea here. The reason why the astrologers are abominations is because if they keep telling people, I'm going to tell you what your nature is, and you act according to what your nature is, ultimately, very quickly, actually, you're going to become immoral. Why? Because if the premise is that I am trapped by my nature, that I am trapped by my instincts, then if my instinct is to rob a bank, that's what I'm going to do. If my instinct is to kill, that's what I'm going to do. What is the prophet? So God says, don't listen to the astrologers, not because they don't know what's going to happen in the future. That's a side point. Don't listen to the astrologers because the concept of astrology is premised on this guy is the expert telling you what you could become and telling you what you can't become and telling you don't try to become something that's inconsistent with your past nature, with your nature or your past experiences. So God says, Moshe says, don't listen to the astrologers. Why? Because we have a prophet. What does it mean we have a prophet? It's not we have somebody else to tell us what to do. We have the prophet who tells us that we have the ability to change morally. We have the ability to not be trapped with our nature, by our nature. We have the ability to change. And that's something that Jonah missed because Jonah was devastated. Why was he devastated? Because he says, I'm a failure. Why am I a failure? Because if you're looking at prophecy as predicting the future, indeed, Jonah is a failure. But if you look at prophecy and teaching people that they could change, that they're not trapped by their nature, that they're not trapped by the past experiences, on that scale, Jonah was a resounding success. And that's why we read the story of Jonah on Yom Kippur, because what the real takeaway is, don't listen to the astrologers. We each have astrologers whispering in our ear, right? My astrologer tells me, don't try this, it's not your nature. You failed last time, you're going to fail again. Don't try to be more patient, it's not going to work. And we keep telling ourselves things. We don't literally go to the astrologer, but spiritually or psychologically, we're going to the astrologer within ourselves, the person who's trying to predict the future based on past experiences. And that's what we do every day. We have our collective experiences. We know what we're good at. We know what we're not. We know where we're going to succeed. We know where we're going to fail. And depending on the past, we project upon the future. So why should I try to improve if it's not going to be successful anyway? Why should I try to become a mensch if I'm not going to do it anyway? How do you know I'm not going to be successful? Based on past experiences. So my astrologer, the astrologer within me is telling me, look at the past experiences. That's immoral. So what does Moshe say? Don't listen to the astrologer within you. Who should you listen to within you? The voice of the prophet. What does the voice of the prophet tell you? He tells you it doesn't matter what your nature is, because you have the ability to break free of the confines of your nature. You could transcend your own nature. If you could transcend your own nature, you could change. If you could change, then don't listen to the astrologer, listen to the prophet. And that's the voice of morality. Because the only way I can be moral is if I understand that I could transcend and overcome my own instincts. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is the story in short. And this is just a sample where the verses about astrology, which we think there's no astrologers today. I mean, once I saw an astrologer, I was upstate New York, and we weren't too far from Woodstock. And I said, how am I not going to go see Woodstock? I came about, 50 years late. So I missed the party. But at least I'll go see the ground. It wasn't really, I think the big festival was outside of Woodstock, but this is Woodstock. So I walk in the main street, literally, I'm not exaggerating, I was about 18 years old at the time. There's a guy with a long white beard, could have been a chassid, except he wasn't wearing a yarmulke kippah. And he's got the sign, and he's sitting there looking at people's palms, and he's reading, and I say, wonderful, this makes me feel comfortable when I read the book of Deuteronomy. These things are still happening today. But the point here is that we're not just talking about the physical astrologer, we're talking about the astrologer within ourselves, telling us what we should do and what we should not do based on the past, based on our own nature, based on what we think we can accomplish because of our past experiences. And what the Torah is telling us, don't listen to the voice of the astrologer, listen to the voice of the prophet, the voice that tells you that you could change, you can adapt, you can overcome, you're not trapped by your past experiences. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is the story in short. Thank you very much for listening. I appreciate you joining us. If anybody has any questions or comments, please share. Otherwise, have a wonderful Shabbos. God willing, next week we're back onto regular programming, Sunday, Parsha, etc., etc. And have a Shabbat Shalom, wonderful, happy, and peaceful Shabbat.
Have a good Shabbos, Rabbi. Thank you.
Good Shabbos. Thank you.
Thank you. Good Shabbos. Wonderful.
Good Shabbos, Rabbi.
Good Shabbos.